Most of our viewers and subscribers know about the air incident and the crash site that is the subject of this presentation. Hi, John Reed. This Aerodinosaur channel normally focuses on the straight technical aspects of engine and airframe of the post-World War II heavy piston and early turboprop aviation era. But we don't talk as much about the bad news that comes with it all, the human factor. We haven't mentioned much of the hidden design flaws, gremlins, and glitches that are present in aircraft engines, airframes, and all machinery for that matter, to some degree or another, from inconsequential issues to major ones, which can surface at the beginning, middle, or the end of a machine's service life. Today's comfortably safe air travel environment stands on the shoulders of thousands of unfortunate test pilots, everyday airline crews, and unsuspecting passengers who were once like you and me, who otherwise perished in unthinkable air disasters of the past when commercial aviation was on a much lower part of the learning curve in the immediate post-World War II decades. The cumulative result over those earlier bad decades is the unbelievably safe and secure airline industry you and me enjoy today. Why is air travel almost risk-free today? There are endless cascading factors that cause accidents, from weather to pilot error to systems design flaws to almost routine catastrophic engine and propeller failure, the latter of which was common in the early World War II decades. Over the last three-quarter century, we've luckily climbed high on the learning curve, but never high enough. There have been geometric improvements in engine and systems technology and reliability, airframe and metallurgy evolution and design protocols, and the continuing evolution of best practices in manufacturing processes and technology, that is, most of the time. Let's take the power plant installation, for instance. Before 1970, engine and propeller reliability has been a major issue impacting aviation safety. From the awkward, complex, clanky, and comparatively unreliable transitional heavy piston engine that experienced regular in-flight and often catastrophic engine and runaway propeller failures, allowing for perhaps only 2,000 hours between off-wing overhauls, to the smoother, more reliable, and less noisy turboprop with fewer moving parts, making engine failures a rarity, and allowing perhaps up to 6,000 hours before overhauls, to the noisier turbojet with even fewer moving parts and failure points, allowing as much as 10,000 hours between off-wing overhauls, and finally to no off-wing overhauls with today's very quiet high bypass turbofans, just scheduled on-wing engine parts and components replacements, perhaps requiring engine changes after, say, 40,000 hours, which is the mainstay for all jet airliner operations today. In-flight engine shutdowns are almost non-existent, but still do sometimes sneak into the mix on extremely rare occasions. And also, in extremely general terms, geometric improvements and tightening of air regulations, such as the formation of the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, that revamped enroute flight operations and procedures, requiring all operating commercial airliners to be under positive control, and the emergence of airspace classifications to manage air traffic control, including improvements in enroute procedures, along with the stringent Class B and C terminal control areas, or TCAs, around major airports that have evolved over the last 5 decades, in the formation of Class A, D, and G airspace for both en route and less crowded traffic areas. There have also been geometric improvements in weather forecasting, including real-time weather reporting, navigation technology, collision avoidance technology, and greatly simplified flight deck ergonomic technologies, such as glass cockpits, resulting in much less crew workload, and improved, more stringent pilot and crew primary and recurrency training, including in-cabin procedures, and the overhaul of airport security since 9/11 that we all know about and unfortunately regularly experience. An overarching fierce collaboration and coordination among and between suppliers, manufacturers, regulators, security, and the airline industry, evolving from not invented here and self-protection mode mentalities in the first post-World War II decades to today's it's not about me collaboration mode. While this is just a modest sample of the major changes, all these changes evolved from thousands of unintended horrific sacrifices by myriads of once normal people like you and me, but have been snuffed out of existence in airline disasters. In the 1960s and 70s, air travel was much more dangerous than most of us would have cared to know. During that time frame, 1 in 70,000 airline flights started out or ended with a disastrous fatal outcome. That sounds like good odds, but it was really not that great compared to today. In the immediate post-World War II heavy piston era, newly minted airline pilots were told they had a 20% chance of dying on the job at some point in their careers. But for crews and passengers alike, this was a "it just can't happen to me" risk that people were more than willing to take. The novelty and glamour and increasing necessity of air travel prevailed. In 1960, there were approximately 1.2 million scheduled airline flights, 17 fatal air crashes, and 199 fatalities. In contrast, in 1973, there were 5.1 million scheduled airline flights, 71 fatal crashes, and 2,033 fatalities, one of the worst, if not the worst, year ever for airlines worldwide. In 2025, the world was averaging 42 million flights, 4 fatal air crashes, and 150 fatalities per year, well below the 1960 levels of when air travel was a rare thing in its early adolescence. These days, it's not unusual to experience a year with no airline fatalities in a given year, but there's been a very slight uptick recently. While the chances of a fatal outcome for your flight was 1 in 70,000 in 1973, in 2025, it's 1 fatal crash in 10.5 million flights. I'll take those 2025 odds any day. To look at it another way, if the high 1973 fatal air crash rate had remained unchanged in 2025, there would be an average of almost 2 major fatal airline crashes worldwide each day, with hundreds dead, and then the next day, and then the next day. That's 585 fatal crashes each year versus the approximate average of only 4 such crashes annually today. So the next time you strap into your comfortable aisle seat, you could consider that you are sitting on the shoulders of these mostly unknown and forgotten thousands of unsuspecting people who are no longer with us due to ill-fated airline flights. Then consider that your safe flight today is safer than walking down a couple of steps in your house because of them. Fortunately, we have full confidence in the fact that you or me probably won't actually become one of those statistics. Today we're focusing on a design flaw factor related to the innovative and promising turboprop aero propulsion that was first developed during the late 1940s and emerged during the 1950s. At that time, turboprop aircraft were in fierce competition with, but quickly lost out to, the faster and more innovative but noisy gas-guzzling turbojet jetliners, which slowly became more efficient and quiet in their later turbofan iterations. The flying public played a large part in the early demise of the turboprop for mainliner airline service, and this is because with the emergence of the pure jetliner, the concept of propellers on an airplane was suddenly considered old-fashioned and outdated, despite the innovativeness, efficiency, and reliability of the turboprop's turbine power package that just happened to spin an old-fashioned propeller. The Lockheed Model L-188 Electra was a new revolutionary turboprop design, first flown in 1957 and introduced into service by Eastern Airlines in January 1959, and powered by 4 3,750 shaft horsepower Allison 501 turboprop engines with Aero Products hydraulic propellers. Up to that date, it was the most thoroughly designed, built, and tested airliner ever. It was destined to release the airlines from the bondage of heavy piston power, which required the largest and most complex spark piston engines ever produced, which by definition had to be overdeveloped to meet airliner power requirements, and were therefore unreliable, often proving dangerous to a fatal degree. The problem with the early definitive Electra design was a hidden design flaw that over 40,000 slide rule generated engineering drawings and calculations didn't catch. As Mr. Robert Serling stated in his book, The Electra Story, he noted that nothing in the 40,000 pages of drawings made mention of a most common phenomenon associated with every propeller-driven aircraft called whirl mode. As many of our viewers know, on March 17, 1960, Northwest Orient Airlines Lockheed L-188C four-engine turboprop Electra Flight 710 from Chicago to Miami, which originated in Minneapolis, broke up in cruise flight in broad daylight and clear skies at 18,000 feet near Cannelton and Tell City, Indiana, around 3:20 p.m. Central Standard Time, with the intact fuselage full of passengers rocketing into the ground at about 600 miles per hour with the help of a single still-attached engine running at full power. At the time of the Chicago departure, the Northwest Electra crew had no worry items or concerns about weather, flight plan, crew fatigue, or mechanical integrity of the aircraft that could have been factors in this breakup. The Northwest Electra, November 121 Uniform Sierra, was only 6 months old at the time of the breakup. The crater was so deep and the wreckage so compressed therein that it became the permanent grave for the majority of the unfortunate passengers who wound up permanently short of their sunny Miami destination. I was 5 years old at the time of this horrible incident, and this was the second Electra that crashed under similar circumstances within 6 months. The first one occurring in September 1959, involving a Braniff flight near Buffalo, Texas. 10 years later, in 1970, it was the Tell City crash that I became aware of and obsessed with when I checked out a library book entitled The Electra Story by Robert Serling, the airline history expert brother of Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame. There is no shortage of online videos on this unfortunate Tell City disaster. Some are pretty good, but some suggest various conspiracy theories involving CIA spies, Cold War, Soviet enemies, onboard bombs, etc. But the hard facts are the hard facts that made themselves very plain to those closest to the investigation in just a few weeks after the crash, conducted by a myriad of participants from the regulators to the manufacturers closest to the situation. There was no such conspiracy, period. Fatal design flaws were quite common in commercial airline aviation up until that Tell City incident. However, since then, the so-called design flaw-induced accident did not significantly rear its ugly head again until almost 60 years later, with two similarly disastrous crashes of Boeing's new 737 MAX in 2018 and 2019, resulting in the grounding of this plane. This happened in the enlightened age of digital CAD/CAM analysis and simulation, not the caveman slide rule age of the Electra. The digital age did not fully uncover the possible flight control software issues in the design phase of the MAX, costing 346 lives in this current era of hardly any crashes. As just mentioned, the phenomenon that the Electra designers overlooked is the phenomenon of whirl mode, which is a gyroscopic characteristic which is prevalent in all propeller-driven aircraft and even in today's high-bypass turbofans. Most propeller aircraft engines are mounted to the nacelle with firewall forward dynafocal mounts, which dampen these gyroscopic effects transmitted from the propeller to the engine so that they do not pass beyond the engine and mount into the wing structure. But compared to piston and other turboprop propeller aircraft, the Electra had a large propeller disc of huge mass, with 4 oversized paddle blades each, increasing these gyroscopic forces, and the 3,750 shaft horsepower Allison 501 engine design, which powered the Electra, was configured such that the power section was mounted mostly over the top of the first third of the wing chord, and the separate propeller gearbox is way forward of the wing leading edge. Accordingly, the gearbox alone carried all the torque and gyroscopic loads directly to the wing structure, bypassing the power section over the wing, unlike the piston engine power section, which absorbed most of the gyroscopic loads prior to reaching the airframe. That means that the Electra needed the appropriate strength and stiffening structure reinforcement that extended well past the leading edge of the wing. Over time, as a result of abrupt turbulence and occasional hard landings that happen with all airliners, whirl mode would put forces onto the nacelle and wing structure akin to bending a paperclip back and forth to weaken it. With the initial engine support structure, Lockheed handled the strength part okay, but not the stiffening part. So, at 18,000 feet near Tell City, the weakened paperclip reached its wit's end with a single episode of abrupt clear air turbulence, knocking the propeller disc off its plane, causing violent gyroscopic whiplash, and the right wing to enter a violent, rapid up and down flutter only to rip off at the root in 10 seconds before anyone knew what was happening. The stresses at that airspeed caused the left outer wing panel and associated number 1 engine nacelle to rip off as well, leaving an intact fuselage, inner left wing, and number 2 engine at full thrust, accelerating down the 18,000-foot trajectory to hit the soybean field like an artillery shell at 600 miles an hour. Evidence gathered from reports from other pilots in the area at the time led to the likely conclusion that a clear air turbulence event was the straw that broke the weakened paperclip's back for Flight 710. We now venture from our everyday physical realm of airline history expert Robert Serling, who I mentioned, to the Twilight Zone realm of his well-known brother, Rod Serling. It's the Twilight Zone realm of airline history that fortunately none of us are likely to experience as others have done in our place. With this short segment, we now visit the site of the horrible 1960 Tell City disaster. As a result of Tell City being the third major crash of an airplane introduced only a year previous, the FAA placed speed restrictions on the remaining 165 Electras in airline service, but did not ground the airplane. Through industry-wide cooperation, the whirl mode problem was identified as the culprit of the Buffalo and Tell City crashes, and over the next year, all those Electras in service were rotated through the Lockheed factory, once again, for strengthening modifications. Factory test pilots risked their lives to prove the modifications were sound, and the speed restrictions were lifted by July 1961, when all Electras had been so modified. The whirl mode problem never reared its ugly head again. Only 5 more Electras were built, but Lockheed lost $50 million on the Electra program. The major airlines such as American, Eastern, Northwest, Braniff, and National continued Electra service, with Eastern retiring the last one in 1977. Second-hand Electras continued in both passenger and especially freight service with converted Electras well into the early 2000s, with less than 5 surviving today in the Northwest Territories of Canada, now mainly as air sprayers. Ultimately, approximately 150 commercial and private operators flew the Electra over its service life. Despite both crews and passengers trusting and liking the Electra in its modified form, its safety record still remained below average. By the early 2000s, and for a wide variety of causes, nearly 1/3 of all Electras had been destroyed in crashes, with most of the remainder retired and cannibalized. That's 1.25 major crashes per year for a single airliner type, an unusually high rate by today's standards. As time went by, one continuing problem for the Electra was electrical panel failure, particularly with the failure of one of the 2 attitude indicators, a very critical instrument when flying blind in instrument conditions. When this happens, most aircraft types can still be kept under reasonable control, relying on the much more sensitive and less accurate turn coordinator, as well as the airspeed indicator. This is called needle ball airspeed flying. However, its extreme sensitivity and limitations to shallow standard turns only, the turn coordinator is hard for a pilot to react to when flying blind. And when one of the 2 attitude indicators failed on an Electra, both pilots on the flight deck could become confused as to whose indicator had failed and whose is still good, and both becoming further disoriented very quickly. But in a disoriented needle ball airspeed flight in an Electra, things are badly aggravated by the Electra's unusually strong gyroscopic propeller tendencies as exacerbated by its stubby wings. Disoriented Electra pilots have found it humanly impossible to regain control of an out-of-control Electra using just the turn coordinator and airspeed indicator, solely because of these gyroscopic forces. Unfortunately, several Electra freighters have spiraled down in fatal crashes when relying solely on needle ball airspeed indications. The final big passenger disaster with an Electra happened in Reno, Nevada in January 1985 on a gambling junket, killing 71 out of 72 on board, 25 years after Tell City. The cause of this crash was an access panel that blew open on early climb-out, whereby the crew misjudged the vibrations as an engine or propeller issue and throttled back too far on the engines, resulting in a low-altitude stall-spin accident. And despite the production of the commercial Electra being cut short while it was still a new airliner design, so to speak, that wasn't the end of the design. It lived on for years as the Navy's P-3 Orion anti-submarine warfare aircraft based upon the Electra airframe, and it was the definitive anti-submarine warfare aircraft with U.S. and foreign navies for 5 decades. A few Orions are still flying with various navies worldwide, some remodified as airborne early warning and other electronic surveillance variants. 757 P-3 Orions were built from 1961 through 1990, and as mentioned, they defined the anti-submarine warfare mission for nearly 50 years. Compared to the Electra, the Orion had a slightly shortened fuselage and a flight deck redesign, as well as its trademark magnetic anomaly detector in the tail, and thousands of less obvious changes and additions to accommodate its anti-submarine warfare and other electronic warfare roles. The Orion was a big success story for Lockheed, both monetarily and otherwise, as well as for the U.S. Navy and Western navies worldwide well into the 2000s. It kept the stillborn Electra legacy alive and flourishing for many decades, making up many times over for the horrors of Tell City, but of course not for those departed souls. A positive ending would be a much more appropriate final expression for the Electra than, say, a happy ending. Aerodinosaur is proud to introduce a new propliner book by me, John Andrew Reed, now available on Amazon.com, entitled Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans. This book is 388 pages long and features 64 full narrative chapters with over 280 black and white photographs, complete with detailed captions. The bulk of the story and most of the photographs have never been published before. All this for only $24.95. Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans helps the reader make sense of a perplexing era in North American aviation. The chapters are in chronological order, beginning in the early 1960s, consisting of first- and second-hand stories about obsolete propliner, passenger, and freight operations that continued long after the dawn of the jetliner age, well past their technological prime and intended use into the early 2000s. If you like stories about the overextended use of DC-6s, DC-7s, Lockheed Constellations and Electras, Martin 404s, Convair liners, and Curtiss C-46s, and the unique personalities that flew them, this is where you will find it all. The stories behind many of our Aerodinosaur videos on this channel are found in this book. The reader will experience this era through my own experiences and through the eyes of some of the key people who operated and flew propliners during this time period, mainly out of St. Louis, Kansas City, Detroit, and the infamous Corrosion Corner at Miami International Airport, flying passengers, general freight, automotive freight, and overnight courier freight. You'll experience the prevalence of lax air regulations during that time and the resultant operator corner cutting that caused both high and low profile propliner disasters involving sports celebrities and teams, rock stars, and freight dog crews. You will also learn how one of the rare legitimate operators of old propliners, who had the largest DC-6 fleet in the world during this era, impacted airline deregulation after 1978 and changed the airline industry forever. We delve equally into the technical and historical details of the airplanes and unravel this otherwise confusing era. I could go on forever about what is packed into this book, but instead of more of that, check out Second Wind of the Aerial Leviathans for only $24.95 at Amazon.com.